before we get into the meat and potatoes today, I do have an exciting announcement exclusively for you all in attendance today. We are launching the Compete Network tomorrow, and I wanted to give people in attendance a sneak peek. So again, Ben, we're putting you on the under the gun here, but can you give me another link in comments to the Compete Network? For people that don't know, well, you likely don't know because we haven't shared this out yet. The Compete Network is going to be the home for the best content, events, and resources going on competing to win. So we're really excited to bring together some of the biggest names in competitive intelligence and competitive enablement community all under one roof. We're going to be able to learn from the best in the industry, connect with even more competitive professionals. There's going to be plenty of new shows on there with actually a lot of guests that were previously on CE Live, like Federico Jorge, who's doing a comparison page teardown with our very own Jason Oakley on Compared to What. There's also last month's guest, Clara Smith, who's hosting Back Office to Boardroom, which is all about how competitive professionals earn that strategic seat at the executive table. And honestly, I'm over the moon with the support we've received from founding members across the board, like Alex McDonald, Andy McCarter-Bicknell, Justin Topliff, Emma Stratton, the PMC community, PMM Hive community. Honestly, there's such a long list. We don't have to get into the details of all of that, but there's so much good stuff there on the Compete Network. I'm really proud of this. I'm excited for what's to come. So please make sure to check this out. It's another step towards what we were trying to do here and build a Compete community. And there's going to be a ton more virtual sessions like this and in-person events so that we can connect. And I'm stoked for this thing. But that's not all you came here for. That's just a little addition for when you get to join here live. What you really came here for is for my guest that will be joined on stage with me now. There she is, Mindy Regnell. Mindy is the Senior Market Intelligence Manager at Postscript. And prior to that, she led Compete at BigCommerce. And what you need to know about Mindy, other than she knows a thing or two about Compete, is that she loves Pokemon. As you can, you don't have the Pokemon background on your Zoom background today. She's an expert quilter, and she owns the best pair of flamingo pajamas that money can buy. Mindy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to be here. Hold on, I'll cheat and I'll switch my background now so that it's the desired Pokemon one. It's a little crossed, but here it is. Going to be in Long Beach in August with this quilt. So I'm really excited about that. And I'm sure it won't show, but I am in fact wearing my ridiculous flamingo pajama legging pant things today. Professional 100% work from home attire.
So let's get into what really matters. Mindy, what Pokemon would be the best at working in Compete and why?
Oh man, always like with the tough questions. Last time was when we chatted before, my favorite Pokemon. I think it's Lapras or Ninetales. Generally, I think I'm going to go with Charmander / Charizard for Compete. We just love that fiery energy at Postscript, and I'm just going to channel those vibes. I think he would crush it. I am in chatting with a good friend of mine who's also in the larger product marketing umbrella and a better at individual Pokemon moves than I am. She points out that he could absolutely beat Squirtle with an electric move. So I think Charmander / Charizard is where it's at. Although I always played probably Bulbasaur.
the fire emojis, I think that when we look at our Compete channel in Slack, it's fire emojis everywhere. So I think you're on the right track. Okay, what we actually came here for is at the end of our last CE Live session, where Claire and Brando were with us. The topic came up around how do you prioritize and then kind of resource accordingly your competitors, especially when you have a big competitive landscape. So Ben, do you want to drop that poll to start with? I just want to get a sense of how many competitors are folks in the audience right now tracking? Ben, if you can bring that poll up. And Ben, we got that one. Nice. So the reason we wanted to share this one is it's come up more and more with us as competitive professionals. You don't have unlimited bandwidth to track every competitor to every bit of detail. So at some point, you need to be able to tier them out and understand where your focuses should lie. So let's we have to do the minute wait on results here. And as we do that, I would Mindy and I were talking about this beforehand. When we talk about tackling how you prioritize your competitors, and we were kind of going down that conversation on Monday, you felt that you had somewhat of a hot take, a fiery take, maybe even what you perceived as a potentially unpopular opinion on it. And as we look here, the results have come out. Okay, we've got a diverse mix here, which is, especially with the amount of people that are tracking 20 plus competitors, I think tiering and prioritizing that's why you're here for this session today. Mindy, before we get into exactly how you prioritize against your competitors, you wanted to share something first, I think, in order to tackle that. So what was that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's probably, in my opinion, a little bit of an unpopular opinion to say that, like, to really prioritize and kind of start figuring out where you fit in the competitive landscape, you need a good solid foundation in who you are. What is your, ICP or ideal customer profile, and really understanding who that is. The reason I think it's so important is because there's always, the tendency to try to solve for the entirety of your potential market. And when you try to solve for that entirety of that potential market, you just have so many different use cases, so many different maybe sub-industries or, individual personas that have different needs, different use cases. And it gets a little bit tricky in terms of like generalizing and dealing with a space that is inherently crowded. I've been in e-commerce as an industry, both at e-commerce platforms and technologies within e-commerce for, almost 15 years. I love this space. It's near and dear to my heart, and it is just unbelievably crowded. I think I've heard people, throw around that there are like 500 e-commerce platforms that exist. And have I been asked questions about e-commerce platforms that I've never heard of? Have I been asked questions about technologies within e-commerce that I've never heard of? All day, every day. I think I was telling Adam, I remember there was this one week, and I swear every day in my competitive channel, somebody brought up a new competitor that I had never heard about before. And they were all like within a particular technology bucket, which was really helpful. And my response to that was like, great, let's keep an eye on them and pay attention to when they start coming up in deals. One deal does not make a competitor that's going to be at the top of my list.
So how do you go about understanding who you are and what your fit is, and how does that actually trickle down into like, what are my tier one priority, like competitors then?
Yeah, so I think when you're thinking about who you are, it's obviously going to vary a little bit depending on kind of the life cycle of where you are as a company. When you're getting out and you're getting started, you're probably much more laser focused on a specific area. It tends to be the best way to be relatively disruptive is to start in one segment, one section, and kind of go from there. Now, as you get to be like a bigger company and you start hitting more geographies, more regions, who you are and who you serve may change. But having that deep understanding of who you are to start out with is important. Now, let's say you're in a late stage company and you're going to tell me, but Mindy, I have multiple, personas. We serve multiple size businesses. We're in different geographies. And I think the best place to start is usually your biggest market, right? For a lot of SaaS companies, and I'm sorry to, I know you're in Canada. Oftentimes it's starting with your US base, right? I'm in e-com. I've been in e-com for forever. I remember when Shopify wasn't a publicly traded company, and Shopify spends a tremendous amount of time in the US despite being a Canadian company. So it's that, and then looking at which market you're probably dominating the most to get that base understanding before you start kind of venturing into, well, we'd like to move farther up market.
And in terms of, I think another reason like we want to jump into this question is I think, especially when you have this many competitors and you might be starting from scratch with your compete program, is how do you even get a handle over which ones you should care about first? I actually was chatting with Aaron. I'm not sure if he's with us today, but he actually asked me this question when we were chatting after last month's session. Is like, how do you even streamline through all of this mountains of data to really figure out who you should be focused on most? Because in his example, he's saying we use Gong for transcriptions, but that's not always the cleanest move, especially when some of your competitors might have very generic names in terms of your tracking of mentions. Salesforce data as well, which I think is critical. We can get into the CRM data hygiene of it all in a little bit. Let's not tackle that bit yet. But he even mentioned between Gong and this Salesforce data, if you hear anyone sobbing on the call right now, that is him. So he was really curious how you kind of tier out your competitors and prioritize them based on those kind of attributes.
Yeah. So, I mean, before you dive into like the CRM data and all of that, and I'm just going to laugh because I have a competitor. I probably have multiple smaller competitors who have names that are very easy to just like be thrown around in, general vernacular. And then I have other competitors who have videos on how to pronounce their name properly. So there's always that. I generally find working with your sales reps to try and tag your calls in Gong when that happens is always really helpful. Candidly, and this probably slight spoilers on how I like to think about solving for CRM data, but the more you can incentivize folks to help you understand who's coming up in deals, the more likely you are to get the data that you want. So when I think about starting at a brand new company and launching a new compete program, and that candidly, like that's my background. I don't think I've ever inherited a CI program that's been established. I guess unless you count like as an exception, I established a compete program. I went to another company. They convinced me to come back, and I re-inherited my own compete program that hadn't been touched while I was gone. So that can always be a little fun. But I think it's getting aligned with your key stakeholders on who your core competitors are, right? That alignment has to come from the top. And there can be some disagreement. There can be some hot debate. But really, like if you boil it down to like your top 2 to 4 competitors, you should be able to find some level of agreement, especially just in terms of who's coming up consistently. And those competitors that come up consistently are your tier 1 most important competitors. If they're not coming up in the majority of your deals, in my opinion, they get deprioritized.
Who are you talking with to get alignment then? Who are the stakeholders involved in that process?
Yeah, so sales leadership, generally your SLT, your leadership team will have opinions. I'm at a smaller company right now. We've got 3 co-founders. I've had conversations with all 3 of them about the space. I've met with our head of sales. I've met with all of our different sales managers, our marketing leadership. And there was generally a lot of consensus. Now, I've been at other companies where if you have that exact same conversation, the consensus isn't necessarily the same, right? Like they'll all mention 2 or 3 players in the space, but then you'll start getting like additional one-off competitors who maybe you've never heard of before. I mean, if you're brand new at a company, you've probably never heard of any of these before, let's be honest. And that's always the hardest part. But kind of just keep a list. I use that as like a general top level alignment, and then I start looking into the data. And that's where, you hit your Gong, you hit your Salesforce, and all of those other resources.
So you're hitting qualitative feedback, just getting their sentiment to begin with, but that's not the be all end all, because I think when you talk, many people on this call can agree that the loudest voice or the loudest mentions, maybe even from sales folks, isn't necessarily going to pan out as the biggest threat to the business. It might just be that within that month that they've come up a couple times more. Like it doesn't, you don't kind of just to follow what the anecdotal feedback is blindly. I think there needs to be some kind of quantitative data that's backing up, okay, this is actually a competitor we need to care about as well. It's not just something that kind of everyone's kind of talking about, but they're not actually that impactful.
Yeah, and there's also, aside from, looking at your own data, you can, do some basic, Google research, talk to partners, talk to other folks in the space about who matters and who comes up the most. Industry analysts are another, great space. That their definition of what a segment is probably not the same from one analyst to the next, though. So make sure you have like a clear understanding of whose definition is who, right? So like if you look at e-commerce as a space more holistically, Shopify is a small business player. Shopify Plus, generally mid-market. If you ask Shopify, they describe it as enterprise. Now, if you ask Magento what their base is, they'll tell you they have a small business solution, and that's Magento open source. Magento open source and Shopify Plus are actually probably the same customer base. So that consistency, depending on who you're asking within a space, don't let that kind of fool you. Dig a little bit deeper and kind of see like, what are the size of those merchants? How many people do they tend to have? All those sorts of attributes that would help you understand it. But analyst reports and as Pierre mentioned in the chat, user review websites, third-party reviews are all great. Be cautious of affiliates. I know that's a thing that happens a lot in e-commerce, is there are lots of affiliate marketers. And the way that affiliates will rank things is obviously influenced by who's giving them the most revenue for a lead. So that can be a little bit of like a dicey spot to go, but it'll definitely tell you who's investing in those areas.
Actually, that's Pierre, I appreciate you kind of chiming in here. We talked a bit before this because Alina as well was asking me before the session, like, what does setting out this kind of competitive landscape or like your threat analysis landscape, what does that look like in practice? And I was chatting with Pierre, and I know that he mentioned he just did this maybe 2 weeks ago, a week ago. Pierre, do you mind jumping on and sharing some of the things that you were doing, as this has been so top of mind for you?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. And first of all, I agree with what you've covered here today so far. That's what I've been through. My main comment is I suggest reassessing your competition on a quarterly basis, at least in the IT industry. That makes sense. And so that's what we did like 2 weeks ago. And as you mentioned before, we look at our executives' priority, what they see as the biggest segment we need to attack, and what vendors they want us to target. We look at CRM data, of course, but the problem with that is that you're only aware of the vendors that you fight, and sometimes you have vendors that are big competitors, but you're not aware of because they are so good that you don't even get invited to fight in the opportunities. So you lost before the opportunity was even open, so they don't show up in your CRM. And that's why I said, look at analysts like Gartner, IDC, Forrester. They can typically tell you that for your segment of the market, the top 5 vendors that customers ask about for new projects are X, Y, Z. So that way you make sure that, even if you have been blind spotted by your executive and Salesforce data or CRM data, you'll get an external point of view that will tell you who are the big players in reality. And the user review platforms like G2 Crowd, Trust Radius, and Gartner Peer Insights. Don't look at the comments, but look at the statistics. What's the vendors that get the most reviews, basically, because that tells you what customers are rooting for. But we went through that like that, and I think these were the 3 main sources of information to prioritize the vendor that we looked at, basically. Not sure if I answered your question completely. Did I miss something?
No, I love that. And it was good to get someone that's doing this so recently with the topic as well.
The final one I forgot, sorry, is like depending on your business model, but if you have a go-to-market where you have a channel involved, well, talk to your distributors, talk to your resellers or your service providers, and ask them, what's the either the vendors that they fight the most when they sell your stuff, what are the other vendors that they sell aside of your product. And many times they can tell you, we sell 20% of our revenue comes from you guys, but 30% comes from this other vendor. And that might be sometimes a surprise what vendor that is.
Yeah, partners and channels can be such an incredible insight. especially on those ones where you're just not getting invited to the table.
Yeah.
Because those
Yeah.
partners are the ones that are trying to bring you in, and they're finding out very quickly whether or not you're making the cut. I also ran analyst relations during my time at BigCommerce, so very much a big fan of having conversations with industry analysts. One thing that's probably worth noting when you're thinking about some of those review sites is there are definitely companies, and you can tell when they're prioritizing getting reviews left on a particular channel. They all just start to sound a little bit similar. And sometimes, there are like places that are used in evaluation. So, Gartner does Gartner Peer Insights as part of their process. So you do tend to see a little bit more reviews. So those ratings, I think sometimes can get a little skewed, but you generally don't know that when you're first like kind of diving in. And I think the same thing can be said for those, affiliate sites where they tend to be overwhelmingly positive. But, when somebody's forced to acknowledge a weakness, pay attention to it. You should know what your strengths and weaknesses are and where you compete and where you don't compete as part of that prioritization. Because when you know what's important to you and what's not important to you, not only can you prioritize your competitive program, but you can help sales and other folks like quickly identify that somebody's just not a right fit. And that can kind of get down into personas or, specific industries and all sorts of other things that I'm sure Adam and I will keep going down that path.
Pierre, I appreciate you sharing with us. I always love when you jump on this. So Mindy, should we get into the CRM of it all right now? Should we open that can of worms? Because I think everyone
open that can of worms.
Everyone just shuddered a little bit when they heard CRM data. But I think in terms of prioritization, like the cleaner your CRM data, the better you're going to be able to prioritize. So you mentioned to me as well that you've done a few things to try and get alignment amongst certain teams in order to improve the quality of that data. What have you done?
Yeah, so I think oftentimes when you're thinking about CRM data, probably the easiest way to kind of dive into that topic is a win-loss program. Sometimes that's owned by product marketing. Sometimes that's, under the umbrella of competitive. But it's a great kind of forcing function to take a look at that data, right? Everybody's constantly talking about your win rates and all of that. And sometimes I just feel like you're not necessarily tracking the data that's useful until you're the person that has to go through it and try and figure out, okay, but who actually won? So when I like to think about Salesforce data, particularly, in spaces where somebody probably already has an existing solution, I like to think of it as kind of 4 different things that I want to know, aside from the sales comments. One, I want to know what are they using right now? Then I want to know what did folks evaluate, right? So were they evaluating staying on their own solution? Were they evaluating other competitors at the same time? And then probably the piece of information that I don't think most CRMs often capture, and if they do, it's not very clean and easy to get to, is who actually won. And the answer to that is you need to have an answer, to Pierre's point, where it's unknown, because you just didn't make it far enough into the sales cycle to know where somebody made a decision and who they selected. And when you start looking and you realize that you have a lot of unknowns, or you're starting to rely on your sales comments to understand, who it was, maybe it was somebody that wasn't in your Salesforce dropdown. I've worked at all sorts of companies that have, largely used Salesforce. I think we've all been there. And that what those fields look like, if it's a multi-select checkbox, is it a free-form box where you're typing stuff in? It's really inconsistent. And sometimes there are just multiple fields. So making sure that you understand what fields are being used upfront is really important. And then what fields are you potentially missing? So I remember I've definitely gone through like a quarter's worth of data. And the first time I did it, I was just sitting there and I made my own column, and I was having to sit there and type in notes every single time I thought I knew who won. And then also, I think the other thing that can get really squirrely on your win rates, right, is are you talking about win rates as a steal or win rates as who you're competing against and beating? Because you can be stealing from different competitors than you're competing against. And that to me fits into that larger prioritization and kind of tiering system.
What about in terms of just like even going back, like getting sales reps to actually fill out the correct competitors, or even is there an enablement piece to helping them understand when there is a competitor in the deal too? Because I think so often when you mention the unknown, there's obviously a competitor involved. I mean, sometimes people will see back to status quo, but like if like training reps to be able to fill that out in a way that will serve you to understand the competitive landscape, allow you to prioritize. There's a lot more than just prioritization that comes with that, but then also helps serve them. So is there anything you've done in terms of like enabling them to better fill out that to clear this mess up?
So I think, obviously depending on, what type of product you're selling and, what space you're in, is there a way to automate any of that? The more that you can automate, the better, right? There's less fields for sales reps to fill in, maybe initially in terms of what technology they're using. And you generally have to help reps understand when people are describing certain things and they're not naming names. Like most competitors in like a really crowded space will have a couple key points that they like to hang their hat on. It's their hook, it's their in, it's how they get to know you. When you start knowing your core competitors who are coming up consistently, you start knowing those hooks. So if I know that somebody is describing, let's say we're talking e-commerce, they're talking ease of use, they're talking about, a company that has almost 2 million stores. They're talking about an app ecosystem that's the largest in the space. Like I can probably draw the conclusion that they might be talking about Shopify. If they're talking about like they have to use a particular payment gateway, it's probably a good sign. So those sorts of indicators that you can train your reps on can definitely be helpful. But I think sometimes just being direct can, and asking, who else are you evaluating during the sales cycle is a valid question. It's probably not the best place to lead, right? Find the appropriate spot in the sales cycle to do it. I'm a firm believer, and I'm one of those econ nerds. So I have a degree in economics. And the reason I switched to economics when I was in college was I had a professor who boiled economics down to like one philosophy, and it is that people respond to incentives. And that felt like an earth-shattering, mind-blowing, break out the little animated GIFs there to go with that moment for me and kind of my journey in education. And that to me is relevant because if you want salespeople to do something, change the incentives. You want data on this competitor that you swear is coming up often and I don't see it, prove it. And I mean that like in all sincerity, like prove to me that this competitor is coming up so that we can stack rank them accordingly.
Yeah, it's matching qualitative sentiment with quantitative data. Actually, one thing we actually do at Clue, which is part and parcel of that incentive is, Brandon, show me the incentives. And Brandon, I mean, you could speak to this a little bit more. I don't want to get into the clue of it all too much, but in terms of incentivizing reps to even mention that competitive presence so that it can actually match up with the data is, well, if they in Salesforce, if you mention that competitor, well, then bang, as soon as you mention that, here's the competitive information, here's the necessary battle cards you need, so that one, it incentivizes them to actually fill out that competitor, and now two, they're actually getting the resources they need to combat, or I don't even want to use the word combat, but to deposition that competitor in a deal. Brandon, did you have anything else you wanted to add on this space too? Brandon, for those of you that don't know, I'm sure you all do, is our own competitive enablement manager at Clue. Oh,
yeah, Mindy, I think you nailed it. And then good to see you again, Mindy. Yeah, I mean, Clue technology aside and how like we can integrate and incentivize reps that way. I think what Mindy said earlier is so spot on, right? Like, and it happens here at Clue as well. Like, hey, Brandon, we just heard about so-and-so competitor, actually happened this morning, so-and-so competitor that, I'm aware of, but, comes up in a sales deal once a year, maybe. And they're like a really small startup that's like just getting into our space. Like, on one hand, I want to help and show that, yeah, we're aware of them. But on the other hand, looking at, say, CRM data and saying, hey, like if it's not on this list of competitors that we're actually losing deals to, or that are actually coming up in a large percentage of deals, then it's not going to be a top priority. And I think it's one of the things I struggle with because I'm a bit of a people pleaser naturally, so I want to help. But there is a certain point, and spot on to this whole topic of, you need to be able to prioritize. And part of that is saying no in like the gentlest, most positive way possible.
I'm guilty of being a bit of a people pleaser too, if that makes you feel any better. I think I've got an old colleague of mine on the call. He can confirm that that's probably true, and that I have a bit of a reputation for that.
I think there are worse reputations to have. I'll say that.
How do you tackle that then? How do you kind of brush aside the need to try and people please and then say no? Because if I dig this hole or go down this rabbit hole, like it's gonna derail us as a business and my work from stuff that's higher value.
Yeah, I can yeah, sorry.
Go for it.
Yeah, okay, I'll just share it really quickly here, and then I'll pass it back to Mindy. Like one thing that I've learned, especially as I'm like having to do this more and more, is just being in the way that you say no. It's like, it's not what you said, it's how you say it. And there's ways to be really positive and say, hey, thank you for sharing that. This is great intel for me to see that this competitor is coming up. I've added it to my priority list, but I also want to be transparent that it's, there are a lot of other priorities that we're working on, or even asking questions and saying, and empowering the sales rep, say, could you potentially find out more about this competitor in this call? And so I think, not to get too deep into that one example, but it's just the way that you, instead of just saying, no, this isn't a priority, it's like, hey, yes, this is great intel, but how important is this to you? And or can we work together and empower the individual to actually look into that competitor as well?
Oh, thank you, Brandon. I appreciate you hopping on with us.
I definitely think, I agree. Absolutely. Like really important to make sure that people feel like they're being heard. And I'm always a big believer, and maybe to my detriment, but I was always a fan of like, I'd rather somebody message me or have like 7 different people message me the same thing than completely miss it. That is just who I am at my core. I like to know all the things. I have a friend of mine that's a former IDC analyst, and we still chat about like the deep innate desire to like know everything. But aside from that, like if you can bucket, and bucketing can be like maybe like not the greatest term for it, but like finding categories and similarities. So, in e-commerce, for example, there for the longest time was historically 2 different types of technologies, and they were very, very different and distinct. So software as a service versus open source / self-hosted. Ease of use, very straightforward, maybe a little bit more limited on what you could do, completely flexible, unlimited power, and its greatest weakness is its greatest strength. And that whenever you build whatever you build, now you have to maintain it, and it's a little bit more resource intensive. So when competitors would come up that I had never heard of before, sometimes you can kind of rely on use your talking points that are most relevant for this type of technology or this specific industry, or, they're really focused on small business and you're talking to an enterprise merchant. Those sorts of things that can kind of help people quickly deflect by just validating information that should be relatively easy to find. Or, you just kind of Google it, and you should be able to figure it out pretty quickly.
That kind of ties back to your first point, hey Mindy, is like understanding yourself and where you sit in the bigger picture as well will then allow you to, I like that you mentioned that kind of, it's not to completely pigeonhole or bucket competitors, but if you can put them into some sort of categories like that for just like quick dismissal opportunities for your reps and folks in the field. What are some of those that I know specific to you in the e-commerce space, but are there some of these kind of differentiation buckets that you could that folks in the audience could be using as well?
So I think technologies is a great starting point. There's generally some sort of business model or philosophy. I know a lot of, kind of B2B is moving towards SaaS in the first place. So maybe you find all of your competitors are SaaS and you're like, Mindy, I don't really see a technology difference. That's okay. Start looking for philosophical differences. Do companies take a different view of the world? Are they trying to solve a problem differently? Do they have different advice, different answers? I think that's an understated bucket. There can be, philosophical views on how you work with your partners or how you think a channel should be used and utilized. Just so much of those things can be really unique. And that can be a way to kind of put other people into different categories. There's also kind of like the best in breed versus, all in one. So how specialized are you and how specialized are some of your competitors? What industries do you serve? Are you laser focused on one thing and your competitors are serving maybe a larger, different segments of the market, right? It's really understanding your customers and what your customers' needs are and whether or not there are advantages and disadvantages. Let's be honest, there are probably advantages and disadvantages to any way you could go about building a product. It's understanding your strengths and your weaknesses. And obviously you can spin the narrative around those weaknesses. I think one of those things that can be really powerful is taking a stance on something and turning what some people would argue is a weakness into a positive. You see that a lot in the way that some companies talk about like SaaS for e-commerce, right? Yes, you don't have the unlimited flexibility, but it's also going to save you a ton of money. You don't really need it. Are you paying extra for those things? And then I generally maintain battle cards for my core competitors. So I use a tiering system and I've used a tiering system in the past. The most competitors that I've ever actively tried to maintain at one time as a single individual was 7. And that was miserable. I'm a firm believer in like really leaning in and focusing. So I build out for my 2 biggest competitors, 2 or 3, very deep, detailed battle cards. Probably another like fairly unpopular opinion. I don't like short battle cards. If you're going to have quick dismisses, high level information, like build a sales deck that kind of hits those high points. But battle cards to me are less of an on the call resource and more of a like, okay, let's really dive in deep and let's understand those little nuanced details. Because if your space is that crowded, being able to validate like, okay, cool, you said you're cheaper. Unless you can go to your pricing page and literally show side by side that you are 50% less, usually it's not that like simple or straightforward, or there's enterprise pricing, or there's additional costs, or there's all these other factors. Like you need to detail those out for people to be able to follow and understand it. So when I refer people to like a technology where like they're similar, it's like, hey, go use X competitor's battle card as like your kind of your basis and your starting point and use those high notes. Because those high notes for why you're different kind of start to sound the same across different competitors, right? You have 7 reasons why you're the best at whatever it is that you do. And when you're building a battle card, you're picking and choosing and picking the, 2 to 3 that are most relevant. So it's pretty easy to start finding those narrative ones and just pointing people towards them, at least as a, stopgap measure until they're coming up enough and they've proven to you that, you need more.
That's interesting. I wouldn't necessarily disagree, but I think the approach around battle cards being not just, I think what you're saying is you don't want it to just be surface level.
Yes.
You don't want it to just be, you don't want it to be surface level. Like there needs to be some layer of like, okay, here's a talking point, but here's why it actually matters. Here's here's the proof points in the pricing. Here's the proof points from a customer story. Here's the proof points with a rep using that talk track in the field. Like it's sort of not just providing fluff, it feels like as well.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to all live in one place. Like you can link to third-party resources, blog posts, G2 crowd, social reviews, Twitter. I love Twitter in like the tech space. It is fantastic and sometimes terrifying. which is why I only use Twitter for like professional, because everybody loves to talk about everything, at least in e-commerce, on Twitter.
So let's get into sort of, we've already started to dive into this then. This, after the prioritization, it's the resourcing side of things. So with your, let's call them tier one competitors, what are the deliverables that come with that competitor? Like, what do you've set out, these are the ones that we care about most. How are you resourcing those?
Yeah, so I would say I have kind of two different battle card templates that I've used, what I would call a full battle card, and then maybe like a battle card light. And a battle card light is really just hitting those higher notes with a little bit more context. You're still kind of maybe referencing case studies if you have them. I'm a firm believer, if you have case studies that are about a competitor, like they should be a steal in like the most perfect sense of the world. Sometimes they don't have to mention it, but you know that like, hey, this is somebody who switched from X competitor over to us. And that can be helpful. And if there aren't any case studies that are relevant, finding one that's really similar, right? So I'm going to use my little Pokemon analogy here. And let's say I'm coming up against Ninetales and I don't have a Ninetales battle card, but I know it's a case study, but I know it's a fire type Pokemon and Charmander is pretty similar. So we're just going to use, the case study that's most relevant there. So there are ways that you can kind of repurpose and reuse content. In terms of assets that I've put together, battle cards are probably the primary. I've done decks. I try to focus those resources on the biggest. I've also worked with marketing teams to create like external competitor facing resources. So like feature comparison charts, not necessarily the hugest fan of feature comparison charts. I think they lack a lot of the nuance and details, but sometimes folks really love them. I've also worked with, buying guides and things like that you can put together to kind of steer customers down. It's kind of like having your own RFP template. And then really letting people kind of build on top of it and kind of come back. Right now, I'd say I'm in a much smaller team than I was at previously. The marketing team is probably about the size of the product marketing team at my previous company. So we're lean and mean and pretty fast. And I would say sometimes I just build internal only resources, and then let people kind of build and use those appropriately and just guardrails in place. I think Alan mentioned in the chat on a voice delivery system, we use Loom. I love Loom. I think it's great for asynchronous conversation. Don't let yourself fall into the habit of like over relying on asynchronous communication. Sometimes it's just easier to hop on a call with folks. But I have recorded like talk tracks on Loom, particularly when you're getting into something that's really detailed and nuanced. And it's just easier for folks to listen to an explanation of like a particular topic. And really understanding like what those topics and things that come up in each space are. It could be reporting, it could be, particular type of feature. It's really interesting and kind of getting into that, like back to that categorization. Like there are features that you think are relatively simple. I know when I first started in e-commerce, I was like, okay, cool, sales tax. Sales tax is sales tax is sales tax, whatever. And then little did I know that sales tax was a whole lot more complicated than that, and that there were particular industries, particular segments of the market, very large enterprise businesses that just need deep complexity there. And so, yeah, sales tax nexus is one of those things. Sales tax in certain verticals, shipping can get really complicated, especially if you think about like Vice or CBD, or Vice is like a whole separate can of worms in e-commerce. There's like every weird sort of thing that you could run into that could run into all sorts of additional complexities. But when you understand those industries and those verticals, you can start finding those niches that matter. So if you're talking to somebody who's selling wine, well, they now have to deal with all of these additional regulations. Where can you sell it? Do you have the sales tax, this, that? And that's where that hyper-focused, niche player can really compete against a really big player. Now, if you're a big player and you're playing against somebody who's really niche, you can start pulling out all those other cool, shiny features that maybe they haven't built because they're not really specific to that vertical. So there are plenty of ways to, play that game.
In terms of, this resourcing side of things, I actually remember Claire and Brandon again talking about in the last session. What I like is in terms of like what she mentions, like tier one, here are our deliverables are sort of, let's get a battle card, an external one pager, competitive case study, like you mentioned, and then some sort of like SDR, quick dismiss, sort of talk track templates, like you mentioned, sort of via like a Loom. Another one that I spoke with someone on a podcast. I'm not going to reveal who yet because the episode hasn't released yet, but it was really cool. Is from a resourcing standpoint, not just on terms of deliverables, but if you're prioritizing a competitor, one thing that they were doing is they noticed like a competitor coming up was emerging pretty strong the previous quarter. And so it became a priority for them. So not just from a deliverable standpoint, they actually built out a tiger team that was for the next quarter was specifically dedicated to that competitor. So it was a team of SDRs matched up with someone from marketing, kind of this cross-functional mini team that was purely dedicated to that one competitor. And that was Adam McTease. That was an interesting, not just from the context of like, here are the deliverables that we're going to do for this competitor. It's like, this is something we want to strategically focus on this quarter, and we're going to build like a team and some headcount towards that specific competitor. Have you seen that before, Mindy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've definitely seen tiger teams that have come together to take advantage of either a specific competitor or a specific market opportunity. So the reason I use market intelligence is I think competitors are just one piece of the market. Also, like, candidly makes me a little less scary to talk to people outside of my organization, because everybody wants to know what's happening in the market. And so I've seen more often than not, I've seen tiger teams kind of spin up around like a particular event. And if you've ever been, in SaaS, right, there's the chance that a competitor hits an end of life, or they create a new version, or something that requires like a moment in time that you can take advantage of. Those are a great opportunity to kind of spin up a tiger team and get going.
What does what do you do when you build a tiger team? Like, how do you set those teams up for success?
So I think, generally sometimes those tiger teams can kind of come from executive leadership, and getting that alignment in terms of the prioritization and kind of the marching orders. I think that the challenge with tiger teams and companies that tend to move really fast is that you can build a tiger team, you can build out a program, you can put a bunch of resources and energy into like, okay, we're going to take advantage of this opportunity. We have a competitor. They just filed for bankruptcy, or we just had a competitor that announced that they're going to have a new version. It's a completely different technology stack. And good news, moving from version 1 to version 2 is much work as switching from that competitor to you. Those are the moments, and those happen, by the way, in e-commerce, like surprisingly often. I could list to you several e-commerce platforms that I would still probably consider myself a subject matter expert in, and they've been dead for several years. I actually used to work for a large reseller of a company called ProStores, which was, if you go way back in time when eBay still owned Magento, they had a e-commerce platform specific just for selling on eBay, and it was called ProStores. And Magento had a SaaS version. Gosh, like this must have been 8-9 years ago since it died. So like, and I still would say I wrote 400 pages of technical documentation on ProStores at one point in my career. I'm a subject matter expert for life. I don't care how long they've been dead. That was a moment in time where ProStores said, hey, you have to switch. Here's our recommended partner. And then everybody else in the space like jumped all over it. And those opportunities are always something you want to be keeping an eye out for, but those tiger teams are great. Just don't like lose focus and like jump onto the next market opportunity before you fully maximize the first one. I think that's largely where tiger teams, in my experience, have gone sideways. But get executive sponsorship, have somebody who's going to lead that program, and then make sure that the core team has kind of a touch point across everybody that's involved, right? Your sales team needs to be involved. Your marketing team needs to be involved. If it's something that involves a partner, your partnership program, maybe strategic business development. If you're offering some sort of deal, finance needs to be there. I've got a whole TED talk on the history of e-commerce, just for the record. If anybody ever wants to like geek out on the historical, how we got from where we were to where we are now, because SaaS is fundamentally different than it used to be. Like that is, I've built narratives around that. And I think it's fun, but those are the sorts of things that you need to make sure you have involved. And then when you get those first group of people in the room, if you think somebody's missing, say something early. There's definitely been times in my career where a landing page was going to get spun up and it's a direct competitive page and nobody invited me. But I had good friends on the demand gen team, or I had other folks on sales that were like, hey, did we get Mindy's input? Did Mindy review this? Did we make sure that this is hitting all the highlights? You know, at some point, if you're a team of one, which I have been a team of one the majority of my career, that can be a little hard, and that rigorous prioritization can come into place. And again, I like to use a tiering system. I feel like I've referred to it without saying what it is, but tier one is like my core competitors. They come up in every deal. We are going head to head. Tier two can be competitors that sometimes come up occasionally. They're smaller. Maybe they're your competitors that you're not really competing against, but they're competitors you're stealing from. And those have a different kind of opportunity, right? So if you go back to that end of life, probably the most famous end of life in e-commerce is Magento. Had Magento version 1, they released Magento version 2 for years, and probably still to this day, because open source technology has a little bit of that Game of Thrones, what is dead, it will never die, because it's open source code, and as long as somebody will host it, it will keep going. So there are still people floating around on this technology that's been dead for a while. So, you know, those can be a tier two competitor, and you're treating them differently because nobody is considering, or at least they shouldn't be considering, trying to stay on a platform that's going to die, but you need to understand that platform still to compete. And then I've used tier three as kind of like regional expansion competitors, or competitors that have gotten a lot of noise. To Pierre, I know Pierre mentioned industry analysts. And industry analysts can cause quite a stir in the space, right? It's that distraction. All of a sudden, one competitor makes several big moves. They get a particularly noteworthy new hire. They rank really well in an industry analyst report. They get funding. I'm trying to think what else can happen that gets a lot of noise. But those all of a sudden, everybody starts freaking out. And it's almost like, okay, but are we in that region? Are we in that geography? How often are they coming up? Yes, you want to keep them on your radar, and maybe they start moving up on that tiering system, but that doesn't automatically make them a tier one competitor. I know there are probably several e-commerce platforms to me that will forever be in that bucket until they are dominating the market. I don't care how many industry analyst reports they crush. If they're not coming up in my competitive set, until you give me more resourcing, I don't necessarily have time for it.
I know we're coming up to near the top of the hour. This one kind of flew by. Mindy, I want to ask a question just on that really quickly, and then before we have to finish up here. But like, in terms of, you've got tier 2 and 3, then especially like let's look at a tier 3, like a real ankle biter. What you mentioned, like the hard resources, deliverables, kind of strategies you'll use for a tier 1. What about those ankle biters, the ones that might come up a little bit, or as Brandon mentioned, pop up in a Slack channel but don't really matter? Like, not that they don't matter, but you get my drift.
Yeah.
From a resourcing standpoint, how much are you putting towards them, and what does that look like? What's the baseline that you need to do for those?
I would say generally fairly low. I would say controversial thing about me, I am incredibly active in Slack. I have alerts set up for all of my competitor names and all of the channels that I'm in. So if somebody's talking about them, a wild Mindy will appear and start chiming in on a conversation. In fact, somebody in my marketing team called that out the other day, where they were like, hey, I dropped a doc of like here's some emails that I got from XYZ competitor. And then I was, I saw it, I opened it, and she was like, and there's Mindy opening the document within 2 minutes of me posting it. So like, yes, it's easy, but I rely on those categorization and those kind of quick dismisses. Hey, are they relevant? Is there a different set of like general high level talking points? Can I look at them really quickly? Can I put them in a bucket? Can I paint them into a box, right? As much as you need to understand who you are so that you know where you play, if they're outside of that space, it is the fastest way to dismiss them. That is where I'm a big fan of quick dismisses. And they can be pretty generalized. I like to, again, have a list of, from a competitive differentiation point, like these are the 5 to 7 areas where like, I'm going to hang our hat on our platform. And when you get really into the space, and this is not something you can do on day one, like expect this on like 6 months to a year in, you can start looking at somebody's website really quick. You can pick up like, okay, I know I'm going to look at their solutions page. I'm going to look at their pricing page. I'm going to look at their industries page. What can I quickly spot and notice and then call right back out, right? If you're talking about apps and ecosystems, whose app marketplace are they in? If they're not fully in a marketplace, how much are they really invested in that particular thing? If that's your core focus. So there's lots of little things that you just start almost getting a hang of. And I don't think you like know what to look for until you're there and you just start looking for those trends.
Mindy, look at that. The clock hit 1 p.m. Pacific time as you finished that answer. That was I appreciate you joining us here. This was really fun. I feel like there's a lot more questions actually that we can ask on this. But unfortunately we have to stop it here. Mindy, where can people reach you, contact you, connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. If you just search for Mindy Regnell, to the best of my knowledge, I'm the only one. You can also probably search Postscript Mindy, and I'm the only Mindy at Postscript. So that's a pretty fast, easy way to find me. I will say, if you want to connect with me on things other than like competitive or e-commerce, and you just want to obsessively follow quilting, I also mostly spend all my time on Instagram. So I am Nerdy Threads Quilting. It's ridiculous. I think I'm right now posting pictures of a dinosaur quilt that I'm working on.
Well, so we got quilting content and compete content. What a perfect match. Thank you so much for joining us, Mindy. And thank you everyone for attending again, giving the feedback, joining us live. I really appreciate it. So we will catch everyone very, very soon, and make sure to check out the Compete Network and keep your eyes peeled for more.